Hi, I'm Annette with the Bartholomew County Public Library. I'm the genealogy librarian.
I'm Kate. I'm one of the children's librarians. Welcome to our virtual walking tour of historic downtown Columbus.
And we just want to point out that we couldn't possibly show you everything on this walking tour. So we've picked out just a few of the families and businesses that were of interest to us that we wanted to highlight, and certainly we want you to be a part of this tour. So we're standing in front of the building where Aaron Tross had his store, and it was called Tross's, a Tross, and it's still on the building, which I find just fascinating. The store actually closed, I think, in 1966. So there has not been an A. Tross store here since then. Aaron Tross was born in Russia. He was born in 1881, and he served in the Russian army for a while, served during the Russo-Japanese War, and in 1905 he came to the United States. Came to Louisville first. He lived there for a while. There was a Jewish community there. He lived there for a while. I think that's where he met his wife. Her name was Millie, or Amelia was her actual name. They married in Louisville. They had two sons, Robert Israel Tross and Joseph Sidney Tross. And when the boys were old enough, then Mr. Tross brought them into the family business. When he came up from Louisville, he started the business here in 1909. He opened a store here in this spot in 1909. I don't think it was as big as it is now. He expanded the business, and I know people have said that when they'd come into Tross's, the clothes would be stacked up high and it was hard to get through and things like that. There were several prices on a tag. There was the price he was asking, and there was the negotiating price, and there was the final price, and there was all these different prices. And so all the people would come in and they'd negotiate with the clerk, and if they couldn't come to an agreement, they'd finally have to speak to Mr. Tross. The stories that really touched me about him were after he passed in 1954, there were people that came forward that talked about how he helped them. Some of the kids who were adults then, who talked about how they didn't think they would have ever graduated from school if he hadn't helped them. There was an article in the newspaper about a man who was studying for the ministry who started working in Mr. Tross's store, and he said he would go to school and then he would sweep in the evenings, and he said he wasn't worth even a third of what Mr. Tross was paying him. And then he remembered a lady whose husband had passed away, and she had, I think, 6 or 8 children. I forget how many, but she didn't have the money to buy clothes and shoes and things like that for her children for school. School superintendent had spoken to Mr. Tross. They knew each other, and told Mr. Tross said to send the woman to his store. And so she came in with her children, and when she did, he sent the boys to the clerk to get their shoes and fit them with shoes and socks and maybe some clothes, and the same thing for the girls. And the woman said, Mr. Tross, I'm not going to have the money to pay for this. I know I won't be able to pay you back. And when she got ready to leave, he had marked her receipt paid in full. In his Russian accented English, he said, "You've got the kids, I've got the clothes." And those are only 2 instances. I'm sure there are many, many more. I love this quote. This is from an article Harry Macaulay wrote back in December of 1997, which again was long after Mr. Tross was gone, but they were still writing articles about him. He said, "When Aaron Tross died in 1954, there was a lengthy obituary in the newspaper recounting his business and civic career. It captured part of his life, but not the most important part. That is alive today in the memories of people who knew him, and the raised letters on a building evidence that a good man did business here.
We are one building north from the Tross building now. We're at the corner of 3rd Street and Washington Street.
And this building right now, you can see it's called Well Connect, but it has been known by different names, a few different names, but for tonight, we're gonna call it the Schwarzkopf Building. Mr. John George Schwarzkopf is who it's named after. And he came to Columbus in 1859. He started out in Germany. He was from Germany. Mr. Schwarzkopf immigrated to America in 1851, and he came through New York and then to Cincinnati, and then he came to Bartholomew County, and he'd moved around Bartholomew County a little bit before settling in Columbus in 1859. When he was here, he had opened up a wagon making shop over on Jackson Street. He was also the owner of the Schwarzkopf Opera House, which was also on Jackson Street. In this building, he had a hardware store, implements, farm implements, that sort of thing. At one time, they sold bicycles. There's a photograph of the side of the building where in great big letters it says bicycles, which was kind of neat because back in the late 1890s, I noticed there were lots of bicycle clubs beginning to start up, and that's around the time they were starting to sell bicycles. Mr. Schwarzkopf was also involved in local politics a little bit. He served as our county treasurer from 1874 to 1879. He served out somebody's unexpired term, and then he was twice elected to the position himself. His wife was Mary Rush, or Roosh, I'm not sure how she pronounced that. They had 5 children. Frank Schwarzkopf was their oldest son. Molly, her name was Mary, but they called her Molly. She married a local attorney named Carl Kohlmeyer. And then there was John George Schwarzkopf, who was named after his father. Then there was Albert Schwarzkopf, and there was William or Will Schwarzkopf. Some of you may remember or have seen pictures of the home. It was always called the Schwarzkopf home, or the home on Tipton Knoll, or later on Molly and her husband, Mr. Kohlmeyer, they lived there, so some people called it the Kohlmeyer home. And this building, right now the doorway is here on the corner, but back when it was first built, it was in the middle, and the transom is still there where you can see where the door used to be. I mean, you can tell that it used to be in the center. When they remodeled and changed things, they put it in this corner, and I like how they cut out and angled it off here. This is the site of the George Kitzinger Bakery. The building is no longer here. It was torn down, I believe, in the 50s. But we wanted to include it on this tour because George Kitzinger and his family, they were such a big part of the development of the downtown area of Columbus. They lived in the downtown area, and they had a business here for 92 years. I mean, they were here almost 100 years. That's just so hard to believe. George Kitzinger was the one who started the bakery, and he was born in Germany in 1837. His father actually, though, was a weaver by trade. His mother died when he was young, and then his father sent him on to America, and actually his father, I believe it was his father, died shortly after he left for America. When he came to America, he first settled in Madison, and he learned the bakery trade in Madison, Indiana. He first got married, actually. He married a lady from Shelbyville. She was born in Dayton, Ohio, but her family lived in Shelby County, Indiana. They met and they married January 9th of 1862, and then came to Columbus, and he opened his bakery in June of 1862. And so the Kitzinger Bakery was here on this spot from 1862 to 1954. The Kitzingers had 9 children. I just want to tell you a little bit about about the children. Their first child was Mary Kitzinger Mitchell. She stayed active in the bakery business. And then there was Lenhart Kitzinger. He died as an infant. He only lived about a month, and he's buried in City Cemetery. Then there was William Kitzinger. He was married to Frances Poulton, and they had 3 children. One of their children is G. Chester Kitzinger. He's well known in this community. He was the founder of our Columbus Symphony Orchestra, and he led that orchestra for nearly half a century. But his father, William, he died at only 53 years of age. He'd had lots of heart trouble, I guess. He was a big part of the bakery business from the time he was 15 years old. And at the time of his death, he was the president of the company. He had served on the city council. He'd been a member of the Chamber of Commerce. He was active in the war work during World War I. He gave freely of his money and of his service for his country. He was interested in any enterprise concerning the city's growth and prosperity. Then there was Henry Kitzinger. And Henry died in 1935 at age 66, and he was a member of the baking firm. He had been in poor health for about 6 years. He had several ailments. He began working at the bakery also when he was a boy and learned about the baking trade. And then Charles Kitzinger was next, but I'm going to skip him for a minute. And I'm going to move on to, there was George Jr. And George Jr., if you can imagine wagons and different things going back and forth in front of the bakery and the streets here in front of the on Washington Street, and little George was out front of the bakery playing, and a wagon passed by, and as it became near to him, he fell down under the wagon and it ran over him. They called the doctor, but nothing could be done for him. He died in about 15 minutes. His father at that time was in Indianapolis and was summoned home on the train. And so that was one of the tragedies of the Kitzingers. And then there was Albert. Albert died fairly young as well. He was never married. He'd been working at the bakery, but he didn't feel well, and he came home and went to bed around noon, I think, and within a half hour he died. I think he had a stroke, is what they said. Then there was Emma Kitzinger. She appears to be the only one that didn't stay around this area. She actually married and moved to the Louisville area, and she and her husband were in hotel management there, and so she's buried there. And then there was Edward, who was the youngest Kitzinger. He was in charge of the bakery's delivery service, and he started out in the bakery business driving a horse-drawn bakery wagon. Edward was married, and he had 3 daughters. So most of the family's either buried at City Cemetery or in Garland Brook, except for the one daughter who moved away. Now I want to go back to Charlie for a minute, because he was just kind of an interesting character to me. He was part of the bakery business too. He was never married, and he died on his birthday. He was 82 years old, and I read that he was a really good dancer. People would come and they want him to teach them how to dance. Laura Long was a Mooney. She was one of the Mooney family from the tannery. And so they had a house downtown too, and the Kitzingers and the Mooneys were kind of, I think they were neighbors, so they all knew each other. And she said she remembered that Charlie would go to New York, and he'd take a trip like maybe once a year, and he'd go to New York and go to the shows, and he'd look at the fashions there, and then he'd come home. And she said that he designed most of his sister Emma's clothes. He would look at the dresses, and then he would make her clothes for her. And Laura Long says Emma was always one of the best dressed young women in town. And she said if he had been born like a generation later, she thinks he might have made a name for himself as a fashion designer. But he stayed here and he helped out with the bakery business. He went every Sunday for over 30 years and would take the children at the Francis Comfort Thomas Orphanage. He would go and take them for rides in his car. When they were asked who they wanted to see on Christmas, when the matron at the orphanage said, who would you like to see for Christmas? She thought they would say Santa Claus. Well, they said Mr. Kitzinger. I don't feel like we can look at downtown Columbus, even though the building's not here any longer. It's still a big part of Columbus, I think, to remember the Kitzinger Bakery. And here's another quote from the Republic. "The thing the Kitzinger family has given to their town is pleasure. May God bless them for all of it. Wedding cakes, food and drink, lollipops and gumdrops, dancing, romance, beauty and music, to which may be added friendliness and good humor and an irresistible desire to help others. What would Columbus be without the Kitzingers?" We are standing in front of Zaharico's, a landmark in Columbus. It's been here actually since 1900. They opened on October 20th of 1900. There were 3 brothers named Louis, James, and Pete. After Louis was actually the first one of them to come to America, and they first settled in New York, and then eventually making their way to Columbus. And as I said, they opened the confectionery in 1900. They later expanded and installed the soda fountain that we've seen inside. That was in 1905. And then 3 years later, they added the concert pipe organ. Louis left the business, though, in 1908, and then Pete left in 1931, so James then had complete ownership after 1931. And James's 5 sons joined him in the business, and then later 2 of those sons left and did other things. Someone in the family, up until the time that Mr. Moravec bought the property and refurbished it and fixed it all up, someone in the Zaharico family had owned it and operated it, and it is what it is today. So we're standing in front of what's known as the Keller Building. C.M. Keller was Christian Martin Keller, and he was born in Columbus in 1860 to Adam and Charlotte Martin Keller, and he married a lady named Jessie Harris in 1882. Now, she actually died in 1901. They only had 1 child, and her name was Charlotte. Charlotte will tell you a little bit more about, too, because there's a building down at the corner of Washington and 7th Street that is called the Charlotte Building, and it's actually named after C.M. Keller's daughter, Charlotte. When I looked up C.M. Keller and his obituary, it says that his occupation, he was a capitalist. And when I looked up his death record, it said the same thing. And obviously, Sci-Ho Insurance is here now. If you have been here in Columbus for very long, you'll remember that this was the home of G.C. Murphy. I remember that when I was a kid, going in and going downstairs to the toy section, and I see people sometimes on Facebook talking about their memories about Murphy's, but this is the building where Murphy's was, and it was there for many, many years. But they've definitely taken very good care of this building. It's in great condition. Going back to Charlotte and the building that's named after her, Charlotte, she had a lot of heart trouble, I guess. She never married. She graduated from Columbus High School in 1904, and then April 6th of 1908 is when she passed. When her father had the building built in 1925, he decided to name it after her. And you'll notice that the building, there's tile in front of the door that says Charlotte for the Charlotte Building.
We are standing in front of the building that takes up the addresses 421, 423, and 425 Washington Street. This building was modified in 1905 by the architect Elmer Dunlap to actually combine three separate buildings to appear to be one building by giving them a common facade. One of the very interesting tenants of this building was a woman named Mrs. Elizabeth Wolfe. She owned a butcher shop in this building with her husband, and they lived upstairs. He actually died very young and left her a widow with very little money and 8 children. So partly from running the butcher shop and partly from being a smart real estate investor, Mrs. Wolfe ended up dying with a net worth of equivalent to around $1 million in today's money. Behind me, on the corner of 5th Street and Washington Street, is a building that is known as the St. Denis Block. It was the St. Denis Hotel. There were a couple buildings on that property before it was the St. Denis Hotel, but that's the building that's still standing behind us. It was built by Patrick McCormick, and he was the first owner of the St. Denis Hotel also. In July 1919, the Republic reported that Mr. McCormick's heirs had to sell the St. Denis building to pay off his debts. When it was first built, it was said to have 50 rooms, and when it was sold in 1951, it was said to have 63 rooms, so it may have added some rooms. The ground floor was businesses, and then the hotel rooms were up on the 2nd and 3rd floors. In that same 1919 article, the Republic called the St. Denis the foremost hotel in the city. On Saturday, April 30th, 1881, the Republic ran an article all about the party that was thrown there to celebrate the hotel opening, and I would like to read you a little bit of it because it sounds like quite the party. The opening last night is a very difficult thing to adequately describe. Society has been on the qui vive for months, and for weeks has been making preparations for the event. The costumes worn by the many ladies were perhaps the finest ever worn here. A detailed description would occupy too much space, but almost every lady present was dressed in superlative elegance and good taste. Shortly after midnight, supper was served. The dancing was almost uninterrupted until nearly 5 o'clock this morning, when the later departures left, loud in their praises of the host and hostess, of the St. Denis, and of the enjoyment of the occasion.
We're standing across from the F.W. Faring Building. I'm going to tell you a little bit about the Faring family, because when I started to figure out who F.W. Faring was, I found that it was Frederick W. Faring, Fred Faring, and he also owned the building down on 201 Washington Street. He had a grocery down there. So Mr. Fred Faring and John Werner actually had this building behind us built, but Mr. Faring is the only one who has his name on it. Actually, Mr. Werner died fairly early, I think in the late 1890s. He was also in the meat business. To tell you about Fred Faring and his family, I want to go back a little bit further to his father, because it was actually his father, Henry, who came over to America first. Henry Christoph Faring was from Prussia, and he was born in 1829. He died in 1915. He sailed to America in 1850, and he came to New Orleans first. It took him 9 weeks and 5 days to get here. And then he came up the river to Madison, Indiana, and then he took the train up to Columbus. He married a lady named Mary Richter here in Columbus. They married in 1853. He was a charter member of the German Lutheran Church, which I believe is St. Peter's. And Henry and Mary had 9 children, one of which was Fred W. Faring. But first I want to tell you about some of their other children, because the Farings were a well-known family here in Columbus. First off, there was Henry Faring. Unfortunately, Henry, being the oldest, he actually died very young in a drowning accident in the river. He had gone to bathe with some friends in the river and got into some deep water, and his friends didn't realize he was missing until they came out and went to put their clothes on. They noticed some clothes still there, and then they looked around to see who was missing, and they discovered it was Henry. He was 27 years old when he died, and he was actually in the grocery business at the time of his death as well. He had gone to Illinois, I think, and had done some work over there, but had come back to Columbus and started in the grocery business. And then there was Theodore August Faring. He is the one who started the carriage company, the Faring Carriage Company. It was over on 3rd and Lafayette, which then was called Mechanic Street. So it was just about where McDonald's is now. He started out with a blacksmith shop, and he ended up making buggies and surreys and wagons and harness and things like that. He added his sons to the business in 1901 and 1905. His sons were Lynn and Fred H. Now that's not the Fred with this building. This is a different Fred. And that's what was confusing me when I first started to read about them. So there's Fred W., Theodore's brother, and there's Fred H., Theodore's son. Theodore's son, Lynn, had a hardware store in Terre Haute, but if you know the name of Dutch Faring was a well-known athlete here in Columbus. He was the son of Lynn Faring, so he would have been the grandson of Theodore and the great-grandson of Henry. He lettered in 3 sports. He did basketball, football, and baseball at Purdue. He chose baseball as his main sport, I guess, after he graduated from Purdue, and he ended up coaching at Purdue, and he also coached at Stanford. So then, after Theodore, it was Fred W. Faring. That's this Fred that has the building back here. Fred was married to Anna Son. It was her brother that actually owned the grocery to begin with. Fred started out in the shoe business, but he ended up buying the grocery store from his brother-in-law, and he operated that grocery store until 1940. And then he sold the business to someone else, and it remained as a grocery store down there until 1964. About the building behind us, it's undergone several changes over the years. Years ago, before this building was ever here, the train used to come through here, and so it kind of cut at an angle, and well, you can't tell it now, but you can still kind of tell on the back of this building it's angled in such a way that because of where the train went through.
The building behind us that houses Sophia's Bridal and Tux and Viewpoint Books was actually originally a post office. There's some great pictures of it in use as a post office with all of the horses ready to deliver mail. And actually, the original door was in the middle of the building, not the neat corner door that we have today. It was designed by architect Charles Sparrow, who also designed the OddFellows Building, which is the pink building across the street. The building behind us is called the OddFellows Building. It got that name because the 3rd floor housed the OddFellows Hall, which was a large hall with smaller meeting rooms for the fraternal organization, the Independent Order of Oddfellows, so the IOOF at the top of the building. The OddFellows is a fraternal organization that was founded in 1806, according to their website, which also states the founders were 3 boat builders, a comedian, and a vocalist, a group befitting the name Oddfellows indeed. When the building was first built, the 1st floor was retail, the 2nd floor was a furniture showroom and offices, and then the 3rd floor was the OddFellows Hall. Some of the businesses that were in the 1st floor included, in 1893, a furniture store / undertaking business owned by Davidson and Henderson. They did the embalming at the rear of the store. There were also grocery stores in that location, including the Great A&P Tea Company, and from 1940 to 1956, there was a Kroger. In 1892, the Republic reported, "Those who think that architectural bump on the OddFellows Building should have been on the southwest corner of the building are many." We have a few people that we really would like to thank for their help with this tour, and that includes Mr. Jim Nickel, who provided so many of the great anecdotes that we were able to tell you about today, and most of the architectural information. And also Trisha in the Columbus, Indiana Architectural Archives, and also the Bartholomew County Historical Society.
Thank you.